A man in a tailored suit embezzled millions. His trial makes headlines for a week, then fades, quietly. He walks free with a fine smaller than a year's salary. Meanwhile, a teenager caught stealing a pair of shoes sits behind bars, labeled a criminal for life. This isn't an exception. It's a pattern. From Wall Street to Washington, the world quietly agrees. The higher you climb, the less the rules apply. Laws tighten downward, but loosen upward. Justice, we're told, is blind. But if that's true, why does it seem to see status so clearly? Here lies the paradox. The weak follow, rules the strong never intend to obey. Why? Is it fear? Is it conditioning? Or is it something deeper, a hidden architecture of power that trains obedience into the bones of the powerless? Michel Foucault once argued that power is not just held. It's exercised through systems that normalize submission, not with guns, but with gazes, not with prisons, but with expectations. He described a world where control comes not from visible chains, but from invisible eyes. Surveillance becomes internal. We don't just obey the rules, we police ourselves. And Plato, centuries earlier, warned of the noble lie, a myth told by rulers that convinces the masses their place in the hierarchy is both natural and just. It isn't truth that holds society together. It's belief. So when we ask, why do the weak obey? We're not just asking a political question. We're asking a psychological one, a philosophical one. Because something in us submits, even when we know the system is rigged. We nod at stories of justice. But deep down, we sense something is off. The scales are not balanced. They never were. What if justice isn't a principle? What if it's a performance? This documentary begins in that discomfort. Not to provide easy answers, but to explore why systems of control persist, and why those with the least power so often uphold them the most. It begins with the unsettling truth. The rules were never designed for fairness. They were designed for order, and order has always served the strong. The most powerful form of control is the one that never feels like control. It doesn't need chains or threats. It only needs belief. In the 1960s, psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted a simple yet haunting experiment. Participants were told to deliver electric shocks to a stranger whenever they answered a question incorrectly. The shocks weren't real, but the participants didn't know that. As the stranger's screams grew louder and more desperate, most participants continued to press the button because a man in a lab coat told them to. 2/3 obeyed. Not because they were cruel, but because they believed they should obey. Just a few years later, another psychologist, Philip Zimbardo, placed ordinary college students into a mock prison. Randomly assigned as guards or prisoners, the simulation spiraled into psychological torment within days. The guards, young, educated men, became unrecognizable. They harassed, degraded, and humiliated their peers. No one taught them to be cruel. They simply stepped into the role and followed the logic of the system. This is not the story of monsters. It's the story of normal minds absorbing the expectations of power. We like to believe we act on morality, but most people act on cues. What will get them punished? What will get them praised? Behavioral psychologist B.F. Skinner showed that human behavior can be shaped like clay by managing rewards and punishments. Give a reward, and the behavior repeats. Add a consequence, and the behavior fades. No need for tyranny, just predictable outcomes. And so, the modern citizen learns, follow the rules, get the reward. Step out of line, lose comfort, status, or safety. Over time, morality is replaced by habit, conscience by compliance. We internalize authority, not because it's right, but because it's safer. We become self-regulating, policing our thoughts, our tone, our questions, not for justice, but for acceptance. It's not that people can't see injustice. It's that they fear what happens if they step outside the approved response. Most people would rather be wrong with the crowd than right alone. This is how obedience is born, not from violence, but from alignment. Not through punishment, but persuasion. By the time someone questions the system, it's already living inside them. They speak its language, defend its logic, fear its rejection. The illusion of justice survives not because it is true, but because it is safe. And in a world where safety is sacred, even the most obvious lies are easier to live with than the truth. The strong don't need to force obedience. The obedient will do it for them. Justice wears a costume. It speaks in solemn tones. It walks in rituals. And because of this, we believe that courtrooms are temples. Judges wear robes like priests. Oaths are taken as if invoking something sacred. The flags, the architecture, the carefully chosen words, all of it designed to signal order, fairness, dignity. But behind the performance lies something colder, control dressed as morality. Justice, as we know it, is not the pursuit of truth. It is a ritual, carefully staged to protect the illusion that power is fair and authority is earned. Social dominance theory calls these illusions legitimizing myths, stories that justify why some rule and others obey. These myths are everywhere. The belief that success is the result of merit, that laws are neutral, that punishment is proportionate, that the system, while flawed, ultimately works. But what if the symbols of justice aren't signs of equality, only the disguise of hierarchy, Emile? Durkheim, the father of modern sociology, believed that rituals bind societies together. They give a sense of belonging, meaning, and shared values. But rituals can also blind. They can sanctify the unjust. When you put on a black robe and call yourself a judge, people stop questioning the human beneath it. When the law is read aloud in a courtroom, we stop wondering who wrote it, or why. And this is the genius of the performance. It hides the fact that justice is not distributed equally. It is performed equally. Consider this. A whistleblower leaks war crimes, gets imprisoned. A bank launders billions for drug cartels, pays a fine and moves on. A homeless man steals a sandwich. He's handcuffed. A CEO commits fraud that wrecks lives. He's invited to speak at conferences. The stronger the symbol of justice, the more invisible the inequality becomes. Surveillance is justified as public safety, but it rarely watches upward. Cameras don't point into corporate boardrooms or behind political closed doors. They watch the streets, the workers, the poor. Control flows downward. Privilege floats above scrutiny. Why? Because the role of justice is not to challenge power, it is to protect its appearance. The harsher penalties for dissent, the softer touch for wealth. These aren't anomalies. They're design features, and the public, watching this spectacle, feels reassured because the system still looks sacred, the rituals still play out, the robes are still worn, the gavel still strikes, but the deeper function of the theater is not to reveal the truth. It is to prevent us from asking, who decides what's just? And more dangerously, who is never held accountable? We are taught to see justice as a scale, balanced, impartial. But scales can be rigged. And when they are, it's not justice, it's stagecraft. This section forces a realization. Maybe justice isn't broken. Maybe it's working exactly as it was meant to make us feel safe, even as it keeps the powerful beyond reach. History is not written in ink. It is carved in obedience. From the marble courts of Rome to the colonial codes of Europe, justice has long served not truth, but empire. The Roman Empire claimed to bring civilization, but its laws were blunt instruments of control. Those who obeyed were citizens. Those who resisted were barbarians. Justice was not blind. It had a sword, and it knew where to point it. Centuries later, the divine right of kings would crown power with sanctity. Monarchs weren't just rulers, they were God's chosen. Disobedience wasn't simply a crime, it was heresy. Law became divine theater, where punishment wasn't about restoring order. It was about reaffirming who had the right to define it. When Europe carved the world into colonies, it exported this logic. Colonial legal systems weren't built to serve the colonized. They were tools of extraction. Property laws legalized theft. Pass laws regulated movement. Speech laws criminalized dissent. The language of justice was used to justify domination. Empires never call their violence violence. They call it law. They call it order. They call it peace. Today we like to believe we've evolved. That modern legal systems are more enlightened, but the echoes remain. Mass incarceration in democratic nations disproportionately targets the poor and marginalized. Corporations, when found guilty of environmental or economic devastation, are fined, but rarely dismantled. International law still bends toward the will of the powerful, offering immunity to some while punishing others for the same acts. We were taught to believe law is sacred. But what if it's just a more sophisticated version of the imperial code? A cleaner tool of conquest, a softer leash. The pattern is consistent. Power defines justice, then teaches people to believe in it, not through reason, not through evidence, but through repetition, fear, and spectacle. Conquest becomes liberation. Occupation becomes stability. Profit becomes progress. And resistance becomes terror. This isn't merely historical tragedy, it's a warning. Because if we don't recognize the pattern, we'll keep mistaking obedience for morality. Perhaps the law has never been a shield for the weak. Perhaps it was always a mirror, reflecting the desires of those who wrote it. Not to bring balance, but to keep us kneeling. When people witness injustice, they often ask, why don't the oppressed rise up? But the real question is more unsettling. Why do they so often protect the very systems that keep them down? The answer lives not in chains or prisons, but in the architecture of the mind. In 1973, a strange phenomenon emerged during a hostage crisis in Stockholm. The captives began defending their captors. They resisted rescue. They bonded with the abusers. Psychologists called it Stockholm Syndrome. But it wasn't just about hostages. It was a mirror, a blueprint of obedience born from fear, confusion, and the human need to feel safe, even in danger. Psychologist Martin Seligman discovered something even more disturbing: learned helplessness. When dogs were repeatedly shocked without escape, they eventually stopped trying to avoid the pain, even when a path to freedom was clear. The lesson was grim. After enough defeat, the mind stops believing in liberation. It chooses suffering, if it feels inevitable. Then there's the just world fallacy, the belief that the world is fair, that people get what they deserve. It comforts us. It makes chaos feel moral, but it blinds us. It leads us to blame victims, to justify cruelty, and to bow before systems that reward obedience while punishing truth. Erich Fromm once wrote that many don't actually want freedom. They want relief from uncertainty, from responsibility. So they obey, they conform, not because they're weak, but because they've been taught that safety lies in surrender. Rebellion is not crushed by violence. It is suffocated by silence, social shame, and the warm familiarity of the cage. Throughout history, liars have sat on thrones while truth-tellers have been buried in silence. Socrates was condemned not for violence, but for asking dangerous questions. Galileo was imprisoned not for being wrong, but for being right too early. Edward Snowden didn't leak secrets. He revealed truths too corrosive for power to allow. In every era, truth has not been a virtue. It has been a threat. The powerful don't fear chaos. They fear clarity. This is the essence of epistemic violence. The deliberate control of what can be known, what can be said, and what must be forgotten. Censorship isn't just about silencing voices. It's about constructing reality. The goal isn't just to deny facts, it's to exhaust people until they forget what truth even feels like. George Orwell called it doublethink, the ability to hold two contradictory beliefs and accept both as true. War is peace. Ignorance is strength. Freedom is slavery. It's not logic. It's survival in a world where truth is punished and lies are rewarded. Hannah Arendt warned that totalitarianism begins not with gulags but with confusion. When people no longer know what's real, they stop resisting. They cling to the familiar lie because the truth feels too dangerous to believe. This is the final betrayal of justice, not inequality, but inversion. The guilty walk, free behind. Walls of wealth and rhetoric. The innocent are crucified for pointing it out. And so, the greatest crime in an unjust world is seeing clearly. Once the veil of illusion is torn, we're left standing in a courtroom without walls, where the judge, the accused, and the jury are all the same person. Real justice does not begin in institutions. It begins in the quiet rebellion of the individual. In the moment when a person chooses to see clearly, even when blindness would be safer. In the split second when someone chooses truth over approval, courage over convenience, morality over legality. This is not a political movement, it's a psychological awakening. Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist, wrote that, even in the most dehumanizing conditions, man is still free to choose his response. That freedom, he said, is the last of human liberties, the foundation of moral agency. When the world is unjust, the question becomes, will you mirror it, or will you transcend it? Carl Jung warned that until we confront our own shadow, our repressed fears, our silent complicity, we will project it onto the world. We'll blame systems for what we refuse to face in ourselves. To reclaim justice is not to demand it from the world, but to embody it. To live as though your choices matter, even when no one is watching, especially then. This is inner sovereignty, the refusal to outsource your conscience, the rebellion of integrity. It's when a person stops asking, what is legal, and starts asking, what is right? Because in the end, the most dangerous obedience is not to corrupt rulers, but to our own cowardice. The courtroom was never neutral, the law was never blind, and justice, true justice, was never a structure of stone. What shattered wasn't just an illusion, it was a worldview, a deeply rooted belief that fairness flows from institutions, that morality is something handed down by higher powers in robes, in offices, or on screens. But now that the mask has fallen, a deeper, more unsettling question arises. If the system was never just, what is? The answer doesn't arrive from above. It emerges from within. The moment the illusion breaks is not one of despair. It is one of birth. A cognitive rupture that gives rise to a different kind of vision. One no longer confined by obedience, no longer dependent on external validation. It is the awakening of inner sovereignty. Viktor Frankl, writing from the heart of a concentration camp, reminded the world that between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space lies our freedom. Even amidst brutal injustice, the individual can choose, not control the world, but govern the self, not trust the verdict, but live the truth. This is where justice begins, not in courtrooms or constitutions, but in conscience, not in verdicts, but in values. Carl Jung spoke of the shadow, the hidden parts of ourselves that we disown, and he warned, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Real justice requires that confrontation. Before we ever speak truth to power, we must speak it to ourselves. Because power doesn't only live in palaces. It hides in the subtle bargains we make with comfort, in the moments we stay silent to avoid conflict, in the excuses we offer when morality becomes inconvenient. The myth told us that good people follow the rules. But the truth is more difficult and more dangerous. Sometimes the rules are the problem. What happens when the rules reward cruelty? When obedience props up the machine? When morality and legality no longer overlap? The weak will still obey, but not because they are doomed, because they haven't yet seen that obedience is a choice, that belief is optional, that there is no prize for playing a rigged game well. The real revolution isn't out there. It's internal. It's not about dismantling one empire to build another. It's about refusing to play along with lies simply because they're popular, convenient, or profitable. It's about reclaiming the right to think, to question, to walk alone if necessary, to become the judge of what's right. Because we have learned finally that no one else can do that for us. Imagine a courtroom, but instead of a judge, a mirror, no gavel, no jury, just you. No verdict imposed, only one discovered, not imposed. From above but excavated from within. It is in this intimate trial, waged quietly and continuously within the self, that the foundations of a just world are built. Laws may govern behavior, but only conscience can govern being. And conscience cannot be programmed. It must be earned, sharpened, lived. This isn't a call to adopt another ideology. It is an invitation to graduate from them, to leave behind the myth that someone else will save us, and instead become the kind of person who no longer waits. In a world flooded with noise, obedience, and spectacle, the quiet voice of inner clarity is an act of rebellion. The awakened don't shout, they don't beg, they don't threaten, they simply walk out of the game. And that's the final truth. No one is coming to set you free. Because no one can. Not until you decide, consciously, courageously, that you were never born to be ruled. You were born to see, to choose, to become.